Hello everyone, it's year 12 micro, this topic here, indirect tax and subsidies. Done all the hours. You're going to be on market failure soon. That'd be exciting. What I've decided to do is split this section into indirect taxes first. That's what I'm going to do in a minute, and then I'll do another separate video for subsidies. It just looked to me that it was going to get a bit out of hand, so I just thought split them, and hopefully they'll be shorter, tidier videos. The concept of the two mini topics, should we say, indirect tax subsidies, are very similar. As you'll see in a minute, one of them shifts the supply curve one way and one the other. So in a way, the analysis is very similar. But anyway, I've split them up. So next slide. And what Miss Fujiwara did by looks of it is she defined direct and indirect taxes, but in terms of the diagram, it's going to be indirect taxes. But anyway, a direct tax is one, as it says there, levied against income or profits rather than on goods and services. I always think of it as it's directly levied on income. So the classic one I know is income tax, of course, that one there. But all these other examples here are forms of income that you directly receive, and then the tax comes straight off your income before you have a chance to spend it. That's the argument. And corporation tax is essentially income for it's a tax on business income profits, so it's another form of income really. And yeah, it says it could be asked to shift D micro or AD macro. D would be it depend on the market you're talking about, because it's demand curve for a good, so watch out for that. I suppose if direct taxes fall, then you have more income and you buy more, I don't know, Coca-Cola or whatever, so the demand curve for Coca-Cola could shift. Probably makes more sense in macro in terms of aggregate demand, because if your direct taxes fall, your income tax falls, and that's true for 30 million workers, then they all have more money as a collective group, and so they spend more money, and aggregate demand shifts. Okay, next slide. And more definitions. Indirect tax is what we're interested in for this video. A tax levied on goods and services rather than on income and profits. And there's two types. There's a per unit tax. So, this, like fuel duty, is a classic one. It's a certain amount, £2 or whatever, it won't be that much, say 50-60 pence for a litre of petrol. It's a certain amount, it's 60 pence, that's it. Whereas ad valorem is a percentage essentially. So you'll see that in a minute when we see the diagrams. But yeah, it's an amount based on the value of the transaction of the property. And ad valorem is a Latin way of basically saying value added. So VAT is value added tax. So what value do you add, and then we tax that at a certain percentage. And then this is important: instance burden of tax, the division of tax paid by consumers and producers respectively, and you will see that again in the diagram. Okay, next slide. Little note before we get to the diagrams: it is important to remember that although indirect taxes may be paid to the government directly by one entity, probably the firm, and it depends, it could be the final firm or each firm along the supply chain, as it says here, the increased cost of production will be indirectly passed on to consumers through higher prices, and that will be much easier to see when we do the diagram. And some examples down here. Import taxes are essentially tariffs. Fuel is a classic one, but there's various others there. Next slide. And it looks like Miss Fujiwara did a sort of step-by-step guide of what you need to do to draw the diagram, which we'll see when we do the diagram. If we just go through these, so you've got the initial equilibrium, the specific tax £3, you'll see that when we draw the diagram. The supply curve shifts accordingly to the left, and you'll see on the diagram, but the point being is, the supply curve, which looks like that, shifts to the left, or if you prefer to think of it this way, up. I've talked about this before, I think. Do you think of, this tax is clearly an increased cost for the firm, so do you think of it in terms of, well, the costs have gone up, so the whole thing moves up? Or do you think of it in terms of, at price P1, I can now, as a firm, no longer supply as much at that given price because my costs have gone up? Both ways of thinking about it work. So left, up, basically it's over in this direction, isn't it? It's whether it's up or left, it's the same thing. Okay, next, mark new equilibrium. Fine. Can you mark the area for consumer burden, producer burden? You're going to see that in a minute. Which area shows total tax revenue? You'll see that in a minute. Mark the point of allocative efficiency and inefficiency. You'll see that in a minute. And deadweight loss. You'll see that in a minute. It's much easier with a diagram. And then the next slide is exactly the same, but the only thing that changes this. So you'll see when we do the ad valorem tax diagram, it's basically analytically the same. It's just that because of this being a percentage tax, not a specific fixed amount, you get a different, slightly different looking diagram, but the analysis is the same. So here we go. Indirect tax is specific tax. I think what I might do is I might draw it here so you can see it build up. So we've got a demand curve and a supply curve. And as I said earlier, because of the tax, and it's a specific tax, which I'll mark little t here. That's meant to be all the way there. So little t represents, I think it said on the previous thing, £3 per unit. And that's why S2 is parallel to S1, because that's £3. That's £3. That's £3. That's £3. Yeah, it's the same. Well, however many units you sell, it's the same. So it said, didn't it, mark the initial equilibrium. I'll do it in black colour, P1, Q1 or whatever. Can't remember what it said on the previous page. Mark the new equilibrium, P2, Q2. Now the next key thing to do, I think I'm going to do this in orange. You take the point where Q2 hits the old supply curve and you draw a line across like that. Now the tax is this vertical distance here. Can you see that that is exactly the same as this vertical distance here? Because those two lines are parallel. Okay, so in terms of the total tax for the government, I suppose, this is going to be equal to units sold times tax per unit. So I hope you can see that in this diagram, the units sold is more O, I suppose, to Q2. There's units sold there. That's tax per unit there. So this box here is total tax paid or collected by government. Now, in terms of the burden, and this is the way I remember it, the bit the consumer pays is the bit where the price goes up. It's this bit here. So the consumer's paying this bit here. And whatever's left is what the firm pays. And the red plus the blue equals the gold we had earlier, which is the total tax. There we go. That's the diagram. Deadweight loss is this purple bit here. Because remember, it's a bit like, what's the equivalent diagram you were doing recently? I can't remember now. But it's a bit like saying, well, look, here's the equilibrium. A is our sort of, supply equals demand, our best equilibrium. This tax has come along and has just disrupted this equilibrium. So we're now at Q2, but that's not the best point. The best point is A, where supply equals demand. It's the most efficient point. So I suppose that purple bit there represents all the, oh, I've lost my black line there. This represents all the units from Q2 up to Q1 here. And each line here represents an inefficiency, a situation where, the demand curve and therefore the willingness to pay by a consumer is higher than the cost to society of making it. And that's bad. You want to make all those units be at point A and be fully efficient. So that triangle represents the deadweight loss. Okay, next slide. And there we are. There's all the prettiness that we just had, different colours, and labelled the points. One thing that isn't on here is the vertical distance. That's the T tax. I suppose we could add that, which is exactly the same as that distance there. Could add that, I suppose. And we've got some things here. So initial equilibrium E1, new equilibrium E2, consumer burden P2, E2, C, P1, which is that gold area. Producer burden P1, C, A, B. I hope my explanation on the previous slide makes sense. Why? And here's the chain. Cost of production increases, so profit incentive decreases. Okay, that makes sense. I prefer, there's less incentive to make the same amount at that price. So P1, let's say, you can't supply as much because the prices or the costs have gone up. Supply decreases. That, though, is a shift. That's really important because it says later on demand decreases, which isn't a shift. So price increase, yeah, P1 to P2. Quantity demanded. So it said, to be fair, it does say quantity demanded. In other words, we've moved along the demand curve. So yes, there is less demand at the higher price, but there's no shift in demand. Remember, demand curves only shift if the conditions of demand change. And then finally, yeah, we've got a new equilibrium. The questions you get here tend to test you on, do you understand what the total tax take is, how much the consumer ends up paying, and how much the producer ends up paying. One or all of those three things are the sort of questions you get. Next slide. Oh, total tax revenue we said, deadweight loss, we said, deadweight loss E2, E1A, yeah, we did that on the previous slide. Next slide, is it? Yes, it is. And now ad valorem, there we are. It's basically exactly the same diagram. You know, these boxes are the same, the total tax is the same, the burden on the consumer is the same, the burden on the producer is the same. All these things, the deadweight loss here is the same. The thing that's different is instead of having two parallel lines, you've got one that's not parallel, and that is because we've now got a percentage tax. You know, if it's VAT, it's 20%. So let's say, I don't know, let's say B is £10. It's not brilliant because it's so steep, but what we're basically saying, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to do it over here because it's a sketch over there and it's a bit over the top, but let's imagine you've got a supply curve like that and one that's sort of more like that. And here's my, so there's S and there's S1 and S2. So let's say this quantity here, that's £10 and it's 20%. So that is now £12. That tax there is £2, 20% of 10. If I now move along here to Q2, I'm going to move even further along so it's not in the way of, so that might be, what does it look like? Let's call it 15, make the maths easy. So that T is now going to be 20%, but 20% of 15 isn't 2, it's 3, isn't it? So that's 18. It doesn't quite work on my diagram either. I mean, the scale is totally off, isn't it? But do you see the point about how 20% of 10 is smaller than 20% of 15? So that's why the gap keeps getting bigger. And that's why the two lines aren't parallel. Okay, hope that makes sense. But otherwise, all the analysis is the same. You know, the consumer burden, the producer burden, the total tax, the deadweight loss, blah, blah, blah. The two equilibria, it's all the same. Next slide. Yeah, and then it looks like you ended on, and I think you probably did it together. You did tax and you talked about subsidies, but I'm going to keep subsidies separate. You started talking about elasticity of demand. Is consumer surplus or burden greater than producer surplus or burden, or vice versa? And we drew the diagrams by the looks of it. So next slide. Now, again, very similar. Well, it is the same. You once again got you've got the total tax there, consumer burden there, producer burden there. But you see what's happening is because we've drawn a very steep curve, then when you get this shift, you're moving along this demand curve. You're moving along a very steep demand curve. So nearly all of it is price rise, and hardly any is for the producer. It makes sense if you stop and think about it. Say you get asked to put a tax of £3 on a good, and you know that the demand for your good is very inelastic. You can just think, oh, right, do you know what? I'll just put the price up £3, and they'll all pay it anyway. So it does sort of conceptually make sense. And you see this at a budget time all the time. They put money on, you know, beer or petrol, and they know they've both got very inelastic demand. So they say, oh, right, in the budget, we're putting 5p on a pint of beer, and the pubs just put 5p on the pint of beer. I mean, it's essentially, you've got a vertical line like that, and it's just all price rise. There's no consumer producer burden at all. They just whack it, you know, the whole tax is paid by the consumer. I think is what it probably says over here. Consumers are unresponsive to price changes, so the firm can pass a large amount of the tax to consumer and see very little change in quantity demanded. Exactly. Next. Oh, that was exciting. God, should use that more often. So now we've got a very flat curve. So now, very elastic good. So now the firm knows that, say they get told, all right, you're going to have a new tax of £3. They should, £3 per unit, that might be it there. They know that if they just put the £3 on the good, demand will virtually go to zero. So they can get away with putting the price up a bit, but not much. So it's nearly all, sadly, a burden for the producer. They've got to pay the whole £3, which is what it says here. If a firm tries passing a greater burden of tax to consumer, quantity demand will fall drastically. Exactly. So they don't. I think that's the last slide. 15 minutes. Good job I split the subsidy and the indirect tax videos, because this would have been horrendous. Okay, good. Speak to you soon on subsidies. Bye.